After weeks of mass protests, a general strike, dozens of condemnations, Benjamin Netanyahu has decided to delay the judicial overhaul to the next session of the parliament in a few weeks. During the last few days, a lot of voices have been heard regarding possible threats of the judicial overhaul to the country's national security. To analyze those dangers and understand them, we're welcoming Jesse Weinberg, research associate at the INSS, the Institute for National Security Studies. Jesse Weinberg, hi. Hello.
Hi,
first of all, why did we hear so many voices among the security community regarding possible threats to Israel's national security? We heard also, for example, the INSS raising its voice against this plan and reform.
So I think the judicial reform plan, which was announced at the beginning of January by the Justice Minister, Yariv Levin, really has broken a massive fissure within Israeli society writ large. And the main avenues of opposition have come from not only civil society, but particularly from the Israeli military. One of the biggest groups involved in the protests has been the Milwinikim, the reservists. And I think that has really impacted not only the state of the army, but also the threats and the perspective of how Israel's enemies view it. So to give an example, in the past couple of months, as the judicial reform has progressed, groups, particularly within the Air Force, military intelligence and commando units, have started to basically say that the continued push of the judicial reform could potentially endanger Israel's standing as a Jewish and democratic state in the framing of the Declaration of Independence. And for them, that was a bridge too far. And what happened this past weekend on Sunday evening with the firing of the defense minister, the former General Yoav Gallant, was, I think, for many people, a red line, a line that was crossed in the sand, where Gallant had effectively warned the prime minister that the advancement of the judicial reform was causing significant fissures within the army, and Israel's enemies were taking notice. And that is essentially what brought us to the events of yesterday, where the prime minister decided to effectively pause the reform, at least temporarily for the moment.
So you mentioned it a little bit. A lot of reservists threatened not to complete their reserve duty, especially in the Air Force and some elite units. What would that mean for the country if that would happen today?
Look, I think that in any conflict, obviously, they would come and serve. That is 100% true. But I think what really the discussion is today, at the most macro level, is you have essentially two directions. On the one side, you have the government, and this is perhaps the Netanyahu government is the most extreme government that has been formed in Israel since its inception. It includes the Likud party, but also the religious Zionists, the Tzionut Datit, which includes, on the one hand, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who was a former member of the outlawed Kach party, a follower of Meir Kahane, and Bezalel Smotrich. And these two parties effectively have been on the far right extreme of Israeli society. And I think amongst the protesters, and particularly amongst reservists, there was an event 2 weeks ago where the finance minister Smotrich called for the effective erasure of the Palestinian town of Hawara. And I think there's a fear amongst many, not only in civil society, but in the defense establishment, that the government, frankly, doesn't have Israel's national security interests at hand and is effectively waging an almost ideological war on the foundations of the state. And I think that is a very open question as to which direction does this government want to bring the direction of the state towards. And that's proved to be one of the main reasons for this large, wide-scale popular uprising.
So dangers are coming from inside the country for sure, but also from outside of the country, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, to name a few. Some people are talking about a scenario like the War of Kippur one. Could that happen today?
Look, I think part of Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant's essentially cry to the prime minister and to the government. He is, of course, a member of the government, but he is a professional military man. He was at one point, candidate to be the head of the general staff. His opinion that was brought to the prime minister was a professional opinion and essentially representing not only the service chiefs, but also the heads of the Shin Bet, the internal security services, and the Mossad, essentially saying that the rupture within the army was causing Israel's enemies to look at the weakness of the state and look at the degraded capabilities of it, and that they would essentially try and take advantage of it. Now, of course, we don't know everything that was in the briefings, but one can imagine certainly that there are heightened worries that the reaction to this judicial reform has caused Israel's enemies to potentially take advantage of what they see as the weakness in society. And that's not even taking into account, by the way, the impact that the behavior of particular ministers in the government, Smotrich being one of them, Itamar Ben-Gvir being another, that has had with Israel's relations with its new partners in the Gulf, the signing of the Abraham Accords, particularly with the Emiratis, who have been very, very worried with the behavior of the government, not only in the Palestinian arena, but also with the coming of Ramadan, which has just started, and that's always a potential for a flare-up. So it's a really multifaceted picture that we're looking at here.
If we can come back just a second to the international threats, do you think Israel could take preventive action to avoid such a scenario?
I think at this point, considering the fissures within the government, and also the friction within the army, it would be very, very difficult for the government to carry out a preventive strike at the moment. Now, of course, I think that if there was a clear and present danger against the security of Israel and a ticking time bomb, as you would say, of course the army would act in the best interests of the country. But I think as things stand right now, really the political tensions here are extremely high. And there is, to put it mildly, not much trust between the government and the opposition after 3 months of extremely contentious public protests. I mean, just so that your viewers know, every weekend there have been hundreds of thousands of Israelis who have gone to the streets. And it's really been an unprecedented amount of public outcry against the behavior of the government. Not only in the legal reform is, of course, the avenue for it, but there is a laundry list of other laws that the civil society, business, and the army see as weakening the democratic foundations of the country, with particularly in reference to the courts, but it's far more beyond that.
And talking about political tensions, do you think the relationship between Israel and the U.S. could be jeopardized?
Look, when the Biden administration has made, in their national security strategy, which came out in 2022, one of their main platforms has been in the safeguarding of democracies and the promotion of democracies. And with this sort of coming clash between China and the United States, it's already out in the open, and also Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the way that Washington has framed the sort of global political picture has been between democracies on the one side and autocracies on the other. And Israel, for the United States, has always been a beacon of stability as the only democracy in the region. And frankly, the actions of the government, particularly the firing of Gallant, I think was seen in Washington as being almost a unprecedented act, where a gentleman who is quite highly regarded there was essentially removed from his job for sharing his professional views. And I think that was almost a watershed moment and has led people to think twice. Now, the relationship between Washington and Jerusalem is, of course, it is the special relationship, arguably one of Washington's, most sacrosanct strategic relations. But the potential erosion of democratic values in Israel is not seen, particularly in the Biden administration, which is, of course, a Democratic administration, and has made, as I mentioned earlier, democracy promotion and the safeguarding of democracy to be one of its planks, main platforms in its foreign policy. It is not looked at quite well. Washington would prefer things in the Middle East to be, calm as they can possibly be. It is the Middle East, after all, and really to focus on the confrontation with China and also aiding Ukraine versus the Russians. And this, frankly, doesn't help in that manner. It remains to be seen, of course, if there can be a compromise down the line on this judicial reform plan. Then I think that would be certainly beneficial to both sides within Israel. I think Washington would be very pleased with that and to sort of lower the tensions internally here.
And do you think the U.S. could take some actions to prevent such a reform to be adopted, or they wouldn't intrude that much?
Look, within diplomacy, there are always things that are said publicly, and then stuff that happens, in private and in the closed, in private meetings. I think the interpretation of what has been said in public, certainly Washington has counseled the Netanyahu government to uphold democratic values and checks and balances. And one can read within the lines essentially what that means. It means, don't throw your democracy down the drain. Israel has had 74, now nearly 75 years of continued democratic rule with broad-based consensus, and any large constitutional or legal changes affecting the balance of powers between the Knesset and the judicial system should be taken with overwhelming broad consensus. And I think that has been the message that Washington has been trying to send to the Netanyahu government. I think that yesterday's speech by Netanyahu in the evening to effectively at least take a temporary break for the reform was certainly seen as a positive step. But I must say, the White House press secretary said yesterday, we don't think that civil war is possible in Israel. And as someone who is an Israeli and who lives here, I don't think anyone in their wildest dreams would have deemed that would be a statement said in a White House press briefing. So hopefully in the next coming months, after the Passover recess, there can be a broad-based consensus that can be found here that is certainly for the parties internally acceptable, and also that Washington can look and say, okay, there is a broad-based reform that has the support of all of the political parties and interest groups, and we can move forward.
Continuing on the national scene, I just wanted to ask you a particular question within the military. We've heard a lot of former officials in the army that were saying that the Supreme Court was acting as a shield for them. Can you explain to us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So Israel's legal system has been sort of widely renowned on the world stage as being a fair, impartial, and apolitical system, as I think any liberal democratic country would want. The potential politicization of the legal system, of the judicial appointment panels, and also for appointing effectively political judges has been seen by members of the army as essentially losing their international backing. What I mean by that is whenever Israel goes to war, there is, of course, a fear of pilots or soldiers being taken to international war crimes tribunals. And effectively, the way that Israel's legal system is viewed by the rest of the world, they know that the courts, the prosecutors, and the military adjutant general will investigate any abuses of power, any mass civilian casualties, God forbid if that happens, and that will be dealt with in a responsible, legal, and thorough, apolitical manner. And this is the contention of particularly some of the pilots and elite combat soldiers, if this goes through, this legal reform bill as is, Israel would effectively lose that international legitimacy and standing of a free, independent, apolitical, and non-partial court system that would open them potentially to investigation. For example, if a pilot or a soldier goes abroad with his or her family to, say, Madrid for the weekend, and there is an outstanding arrest warrant, they could end up under international tribunals in The Hague. This is the contention that some are making. It remains to be seen if things will ever get to that point, but this is one of the arguments that is being heard here with regards to the military angle of the military international law angle of the reform.
Thank you very much, Jesse Weinberg, for this explanation. We'll be following the scene very closely in the following weeks. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.